A very good afternoon and welcome to this live webinar coming to you from Johannesburg, South Africa. And we are talking about the role of South Africa in the BRICS grouping. We are very, very privileged to have Busi Mabuza, who's the chairperson, the South Africa chapter of the BRICS Business Council. We have Leslie Marsdorp, Vice President and Chief Financial Officer, the New Development Bank, and Ziad Suleiman, who's chair of the SA BRICS Business Council Digital Economy Working Group. Thanks all for joining us. We will be taking questions from our audience later in the session, but Busi, I want to start with you, Madam Chair, and get a sense of South Africa's role over the last, 2023 is a big year for us. That's 10 years in the BRICS grouping. We take over as chair of the grouping at that point. Let's get a sense from you as to what you've seen unfolding over almost the last decade.
Bronwyn, thank you so much for the opportunity. So South Africa has been part of the BRICS formation, if I recall, since 2011 or thereabouts. The BRICS Business Council was, however, launched in 2013 when South Africa hosted the BRICS nations at Zimbabwe in KwaZulu-Natal. So it's a big year for the BRICS Business Council because we'll be celebrating our 10th anniversary. However, South Africa as a nation has been part of BRICS for a while longer. Bronwyn, just to look at the potential, the benefits, in my view, of having been part of this club, I need not remind anybody in this room, in this virtual room, that BRICS holds the voice of more than 40% of the world population. Two of the economies that are represented in BRICS are in the top 5 in size, economies in the world, and growing at a rate that will no doubt mean that they will become even more and more significant going forward. South Africa is, of course, a small player if we look at ourselves as only South Africa. However, I keep reminding everybody when I get an opportunity to talk about our role in BRICS that we must hold the voice of the 1.3 billion Africans of this continent, 60% of whom are under the age of 25, getting more and more educated, very aspirational. So we are the continent of the future. Our presence in the BRICS structure is therefore important, not just for South Africa, but also for the rest of the continent. And just to conclude in my opening remarks, Bronwyn, South Africa may be the 3rd largest economy in the continent. However, our infrastructure, be it logistics, be it the financial services framework, be it governance, is absolutely attractive to the business partners in the BRICS countries for them to come and locate here in order for them to take advantage of the opportunity that the continent offers.
Now, let me bring you in here because obviously the last 2.5 years, everyone is saying that the advancement that we've seen in digitization is as much as we would potentially have seen in a 10-year period. And this must have a huge implication for the digital work group in terms of BRICS. Can you give me a sense of what is happening and how the agenda has changed?
Yeah, look, it's an exciting landscape, right? And I think his remarks are really, really apt because the opportunity, but also the ability just to play on the same playing field is immense for us. You know, not only do we have opportunity in South Africa, but we also have opportunity to leverage global markets, right? And with the world of the internet, with the world of 4IR emerging in towards 5IR, and all of those types of things, the world has really become one. So when you take the landscape of South Africa, you look at the last 10 years and the advocacy that we've had from a technology revolution perspective and the advocacy of where we're going, it's really remarkable. From perspective of South Africa, you know, our discussions with our BRICS nations have been really, really beneficial. You know, we have the same types of challenges, some of them on different scales, but ultimately we're all grappling with similar issues, right? So how do you get greater efficiencies? How do you automate better? How do you get better digital skills? How do you extract value from each other's economies? How do we make sure we cut out on duplication? All of these are facets that technology can certainly assist with. You know, when Busi speaks about the 60% of the population of Africa being under the age of 25, it sheds a light on the responsibility that we have as leaders in order to give all of that 60% promise into the future. And if you think about the scale and the responsibility, that can certainly be achieved through digitization. So the world of 4IR, whether it be in the form of cloud or digital education or scaling through, you know, the use of analytics, all of those types of things are really remarkable opportunities for us to take advantage of.
Leslie, I want to talk about the New Development Bank, obviously. I want you to just give our audience an overview of the formation of the New Development Bank and how you play in this ecosystem. I think that's a good place to start.
Thank you very much for having me, Bronwyn. I hope you can hear me clearly. I lost you there momentarily. I think it's very important to start with at the foundation. The bank is only 7 years old. It's still a very young institution. I was very fortunate to have been there from day one in July the 7th, a couple of days' time. It will be our anniversary when the bank was actually established. Now, the bank was established, I would say, firstly, to give greater voice and greater sort of political expression for the emerging markets who over the last 30, 40 years have grown to become significant, bigger economic players in the world economy. So China, India, Brazil, Russia, all of these economies, they were quite marginal if you look at the composition and the actual voting power of the developed world. So if you take the Africa Development Bank, Asia Development Bank, European Investment Bank, World Bank, all of these institutions in aggregate, the control structures and the voting powers resides with the Western European countries and the United States. So the bank was formed to complement these institutions and to give greater voice for emerging markets. So what have we done in the last 7 years? In the last 7 years, we have approved over $33 billion of infrastructure projects, just over $6 billion of that for South Africa. So South Africa joining the BRICS formation was a very inspired decision way back in 2011, and I think more benefits can be derived from our participation in what will now become an emerging markets formation. Before it was just BRICS, only the 5 big economies, but it's now morphed into a much bigger global enterprise.
And Pusi there, yes, you want to continue there?
Yes, I just wanted to remind us that most of the funding that has been raised by South Africa from the New Development Bank has gone into critical sectors such as water, transport, energy, and of course there was initially a limitation that the NDB imposed, that they would like to only deal with sovereigns and quasi-sovereign entities. However, now with the opening of their business to the private sector, I expect that we will see much more excitement as South Africa and the continent look at the massive infrastructure that we need in order to connect the continent better and in order to realize the African Continental Free Trade Area.
Yeah,
we'll come to the African Continental Free Trade. Yes, yeah. If
you don't mind, you know, when you listen to the comments from Leslie and Busi, right, I think that brings into play the public-private partnership framework, which is so essential in emerging markets. You know, here we in South Africa have a great amount of benefit on both sides, but ultimately that collaboration and engagement is what unlocks that opportunity. So I think when you look at digital and you look at the partnerships and the engagement, you know, all catapulted along with the investment and the ability to leverage the funds and to play on a bigger stage. Now we're starting to become meaningful, right? And by becoming meaningful, we give promise to our youth, and to our economies, and we give confidence because now we're starting to build sectors and attract work, reduce unemployment, do all of those good things that we're all interested in.
As you were saying, and just to pick up on Busi, what you were saying earlier about the investment framework being in water, energy, sanitation, as you say now, it will be broader, because I think a lot of businesses that have tuned into this broadcast are asking the question, I haven't seen the benefit at the ground level. And Busi, if I hear you correctly, and I hear what Ziad's saying, we will start seeing the impact, and small, medium enterprises, as well as big business, will be able to tap into the opportunities. Would that be a fair statement?
It is a fair and an important statement, Bronwyn. The president actually, in the lead up to the 14th BRICS summit, which was held just last month under the chairship of China, reminded us that 17% of our exports are going to the BRIC countries. 29% of the imports are coming from the BRIC countries. Of course, we do need to close that net import-export gap so that we are benefiting equally. But having said that, if one looks at sectors that have been, I think, that have made a concerted effort at taking advantage of the BRIC opportunity, one of my favorite is the agriculture sector. That sector accounts for around 2.5% of our GDP, if I'm not wrong. If you include agro-processing, it's around 7.5%. A lot of our very finest fresh produce ends up in some of the BRIC countries, but there's opportunity to grow that even further. Citrus, for example, Russia takes 7% of our citrus, 12% of our pears, and I expect that China will also increase its imports from our products, such as fresh produce. Having said that, if I may come to benefit for small and medium enterprises, because that's probably the biggest gap we have in terms of our delivery to date. First of all, South Africa, I said, has got the infrastructure, but also the capability to produce high standard, high quality products, which I think could be very attractive to many nations. In 2021, under the chairship of India, of course, we were still under COVID lockdowns, a virtual trade fair was hosted by India on a fantastic platform, actually, which I would like to hear more about. And that trade fair, we had over 150 South African companies, many of which were small to medium enterprises, exhibiting at this virtual trade fair. We were surpassed only in terms of our numbers by India, who were the host. Everybody else had less exhibitors. We should have followed that up with more exhibitions so that the small, medium enterprises get such opportunity. But I'm sure that under South Africa's chairship, we are going to be able to do that.
Busi, you mentioned Russia, and I don't think this would be an authentic conversation if I didn't ask you the question, the elephant in the room. Has the geopolitical environment impacted the BRICS grouping, and to what extent? I'd just like to deal with that once off from your perspective as chair.
Bronwyn, the fuel prices that we're experiencing at the moment must have a direct correlation to what is happening in Russia and the Ukraine. We saw products such as vegetable oils and wheat increasing in price. We are concerned, from my perspective as a non-executive director of the IDC, very concerned about the availability of essential agro-facing products such as fertilizer because of the amounts that we import from a country such as Russia. So the impact is no doubt absolutely there, which I believe is the reason that our president has continued to call on the two countries to get onto a negotiating table and to try and resolve the issues rather through negotiations than the tragedy that we're seeing at the moment when we look at the visuals that come out of the Ukraine.
Leslie, I want to bring in here the New Development Bank and the opportunity. Busi mentioned earlier in the conversation the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, at the boardroom table, in terms of the New Development Bank, is this being part of the key discussions in terms of opening up the largest free trade area in the world, potentially? Is it something that people are getting excited about?
Ronald, I think one of the key strategic priorities of the bank, the next key, most important priority for the bank is to expand beyond the BRICS countries. As you know, the process started in 2021. We had Egypt, who's now a full member of the New Development Bank, Bangladesh, United Arab Emirates, as well as Uruguay. So the expansion of the bank is critical because at this stage, South Africa can only lend, or the New Development Bank can only do business in member countries. So the the free trade agreement will be revolutionary in Africa in terms of its potential impact. But the bank as an enterprise, we can only invest in infrastructure in countries that are formally members of the bank. So membership expansion is one of the key drivers for us. One of the second key drivers, which Busi also mentioned, is to lend more and work closer with the private sector. As you correctly pointed out, we started out mainly with loans and development assistance to government, state-owned enterprises, the likes of Transnet, Eskom, TCTA in the water sector, Industrial Development Corporation, Development Bank of Southern Africa, and so on. These are our main clients in South Africa, because the bulk of the big economic infrastructure in South Africa, as you know, is really provided by all of these entities, upgrading of our roads through SANRAL, the ports and the rail infrastructure, the provision of energy, and so on. We do not really, to be clear, provide financial support to the SMME sector, and the reason is very simple. As an institution, we are focused on the provision of productive economic infrastructure, and our loans, typically the smallest loan we would provide typically is about $100 million, which is over 1.5 billion rand. The average size of our loans is around $200 to $250 million. Because we want to provide the necessary logistics and the base infrastructure which SMMEs are dependent on for their businesses to run. Today, as we started this webinar, the electricity just went off. Small businesses every day are unable to expand, unable to do their basic, run their basic enterprises. Our economy is not growing because of that. So sorting out the energy challenge is one of our key priorities, working closely with the government and Eskom to look at how we can bring on board in the accelerated, most fastest way possible, new generation capacity in the next number of years.
Leslie, I think that's very important, and I just want to pick up there a moment before I come to you, Ziad. How do you measure the impact that you are having with those investments, working closely with the government? Because this is what many people must be thinking. Well, that money is going to the government, and depending on how it's being spent, we may not actually see the benefits of it. So I'm sure you have very strict criteria when it comes to measuring, monitoring, and feedback.
Absolutely, Bronwyn. As you know, we're not like a traditional bank like Absa or Nedbank or First Rand or Barclays. We are a development bank, so we assess development impact. So when we, for example, provide a loan, as we did to Transnet for $300 million to upgrade the port of Durban, there's huge efficiency constraints in that port. So this money is for deepening and widening the port, because that's the port through which most of our imports and exports go. That money is not going on the Transnet balance sheet, and they can sort of utilize the $300 million as they see fit, and maybe spend $100 million on the general freight business. No, they cannot do that. The money is earmarked for that particular purpose. There's detailed assessments, both on the environmental side, on the ESG side, and detailed development impact outcomes that we measure. So our loans is not of a generic budget support kind. It's not like the IMF, which provides financial or budgetary support to the government, and that money can go to, provision of housing or social welfare systems and so on. Our funding is for infrastructure, and we need to see that that port is being built, that the money is procured for that purpose.
Ziad, I want you to give us some insight into the talk around the boardroom table when it comes to the BRICS Digital Economy Work Group. I'm actually fascinated as to what themes you must be tabling in this fast-changing environment with this accelerated connectivity that has really transformed all of our lives and many, many work environments globally.
Yeah, thanks, Bronwyn. Look, for us, the approach that we've adopted is one of inclusivity, to make sure that as an economy, the mass population and ultimately looking after all people is front of mind. And in order to achieve that, for us, one of the fundamental things that we focus on is connectivity. You cannot play in the digital world if you don't have connectivity. You cannot scale if you don't have connectivity. So for us, what's very important is a person sitting in the middle of Sandton has got to have the same level of connectivity as a person sitting in probably middle KwaZulu-Natal rural areas, right? And for us, that's important because the education that you can stream through efficient connectivity means that you're giving those people a chance. So connectivity is one of the fundamental aspects that we focused on in order to create inclusivity. The second part that we focused on is around SMMEs, and people have already spoken about that. For us, we believe that mainstream large corporates are not the only source of driving the economy. If we do want more people to participate in the mainstream economy as well as improve the fiscus, we have to get more people really participating. And that participation comes by, getting smaller and medium and micro businesses starting to, come forward with innovation, starting to utilize mainstream opportunity, and therefore as they grow, they'll employ more people, reduce the unemployment, but also make South Africa a more viable destination because our skills are in a much better place. The third area that we focused on is on skills. We do know that there is a deficiency all over the world around digital skills. The more skills you have, the more attractive you become. So not only in our group as digital economy, but also we have a skills working group that's also focused on these aspects, right? Because we really believe that in order to be an attractive market, you have to have the right skills, people of the right caliber, you have to have the right capacity in order to promote a good output, and that's very important. And then the last area that we really focused on is around e-commerce and platforms. By linking skills and connectivity and giving people an opportunity to participate on an e-commerce platform, it means that they can traverse borders and participate throughout South Africa, but also into the globe. And by creating those opportunities, you in essence create inclusivity by opening up the parameters. Over and above the South African objectives, we're also working very closely with our BRICS counterparts. So we are focused on specific industries like how do you do far better beneficial mining? How do you get greater efficiencies around the digital economy in the form of healthcare? How do we make sure that we do develop AI and artificial intelligence in a constructive manner that benefits everybody, but also in a responsible manner that has the right level of ethics built around it? So there are multiple dialogues in a number of different platforms in order to not only build our internal economy, but also make us attractive for global investors, for us not only to be able to attract work into South Africa, but also make sure that we give, a productive landscape to attract people to come to South Africa and participate in our economy.
Busi, a high-level question here is actually just to take a step back and say the BRICS grouping itself, how does that play on the global stage as a grouping? I mean, is it gathering momentum and is it leveraging that position as powerful emerging markets in the global order?
So, Bronwyn, if I may start with a topic that I feel so strongly about, which is how the availability or otherwise of digital platforms impacts on the young populations. I worry to this day that the rural-urban divide may have been amplified by the COVID lockdowns, because in many schools in the urban areas, some plan was made, young people were able to download their texts and books and continue studying. In the rural areas, because we didn't have those kinds of platforms, young people were just confined to staying at home and waiting for the schools to reopen. So the work that my colleague Ziad is doing is absolutely important. And I hope that as we work on the big infrastructure in the urban areas, we won't neglect the rural areas, because those are equally important. Coming to your question, Bronwyn, the BRICS grouping, of course, the 2 years under COVID has led everybody to take a step back a bit. And we saw, in fact, in 2020, quite a number of nations turning very inwards. I need not remind you that essentials such as personal protective equipment, which we didn't have in the kind of volumes that we needed, were suddenly not available when China closed its supply chains. Things such as the APIs were suddenly scarce because India decided to rather focus on protecting their own nation and not or prioritize their own nation before supplying everybody else. Because of the relationships that we have built and the networks that we've built in the BRICS formations, a minimum of 3 of my colleagues in the council were working through the very important initiative called the Solidarity Fund to ensure that they reach out to these nations, to our counterparts in China and India, to make sure that they make available, not just to South Africa, but to the rest of the continent, the PPE and the medication that was required. So that was a great achievement, I think, from our side. When we come to the global stage, of course, the big nations are represented in fora such as the G7 and the G20. The voice of the BRICS nations, I, however, believe has become increasingly important post the Trump era that we saw in the United States, where multilateralism all of a sudden counted for very little. BRICS nations believe in multilateralism. They believe in respecting each other and each other's ambitions. However, they also see the value in having a collective voice on the global stage. I have read, of course, a number of criticisms that refer back to Jim O'Neill when he crafted the BRIC terminology for the 4 nations before South Africa joined, and how some analysts are pointing out that these economies have actually diverged in their development. However, the opportunity remains for us to increase exports, to increase imports to each other, to support each other in terms of technology that is made available. I would love, for example, to see, because I'm so concerned, Bronwyn, that years after our renewable energy independent power producer program started, we are still at a point where the country is saying we don't have the local content that the regulation requires. Why have we not reached out to our partners in China and asked them to bring plants into the country? We know that their technology has been improving on this front.
I'm just going to encourage our audience at this time to engage with questions that you may have for for either Ziad, Busi, or for Leslie. Just need to type your questions into the sidebar, and I'll definitely direct them to the appropriate panelist. Leslie, Busi mentions COVID, the impact of the last 2.5 years we obviously can't ignore. To what extent did that change the mandate for the new development bank over that period? How did you react to the world and specifically the emerging market need?
I think COVID was an important moment for the bank to demonstrate its counter-cyclical role. So what happened during COVID, the economy went into deep crisis. Africa contracted 7% during that year. Pretty much every other economy except China went into deep economic distress. The bank completely shifted its business over those 2 years, 2020 and 2021. We directed all of our funding away from traditional economic infrastructure, away from the building of new power and ports and road and rail and digital infrastructure towards COVID. We provided, and we were the first bank to provide economic assistance to all of the BRICS countries. By the way, when the pandemic hit China in Wuhan in December, January of 2020, the new development bank was the first one to provide a loan of $1 billion to China. In about March, about 6-8 weeks after the pandemic hit, we approved the loan to South Africa, I remember, on the 1st of April, and disbursed that in June 2020 within a matter of weeks of the assistance being required. So we demonstrated that we can be agile, we can be nimble, we can respond quickly in moments of crises. However, COVID also deepened the economic distress in our countries. We're now focused on economic reconstruction, economic revitalization. And this, unfortunately, is where we've got some major challenges here in South Africa, energy being the one that is most visible, but I believe that there are other equally important ones: water, road in infrastructure, upgrading of our rail, efficiency of our ports, and so on. And that is our key priority for the next 5 years in South Africa.
Ziad, Leslie mentions energy, and I've had this debate on numerous stages across Africa, that energy is actually the starting point for everything. I mean, as the Digital Economy Working Group, this must be a key focus area for you as well, because without energy, you can't have digitization. To what extent does your conversation anchor around energy provision to the most rural parts of the country?
Now, look, it's an absolute fundamental, right? It's like fuel to a motor vehicle. It's exactly the same thing. Without the fuel, you can't move. So the reality is that we all reliant on energy. We all understand the challenges, but really, we all have to put our minds together in order to solve the crisis. And I think with the support of, the new development bank and other partners, we can certainly get through it. What we do need as leaders is to be optimistic. Switching that attention back into the digital economy, it's absolutely fundamental, because without the electricity, you can't even get your computer to last for more than maybe 2, 3, 4 hours, right? Let alone the connectivity. So in order to have a productive society, electricity and energy is fundamental. However, within the constraints of what we have, we also have digital solutions that do support when we don't have energy. So for example, how do we become far more effective around solar? How do we use backup UPSs in order to carry us through the portions of the day where we don't have the electricity? So when you think solution, we have to think much broader, right? And from a digital economy perspective, it's really around finding solutions, using technology to enable business and society. And these are some of the examples, that do carry us through. It doesn't totally erode the fact that energy is fundamental, but there are ways that technology can support through these types of problems.
And just to add a point there, Bronwyn, I agree wholeheartedly with there. In addition to, when we look at generation, we think of solar, wind, but to talk about the new solutions around battery energy storage, we should be focusing also on the new technologies so that we can complement our efforts to bring on board new supply.
Yeah, and Bronwyn, just perhaps maybe one step further to your question around rural areas, right? This is a fundamental that we need to solve. So like we're thinking about connectivity into the rural areas, so do we need to think about alternative forms of energy into those rural areas. But what we really need to get right is, how do you create it as a bundle? How do you make sure that your energy is coupled with your connectivity, is coupled with better infrastructure, is coupled with better data, is coupled with better citizenship, right? And it's really around that journey and bringing all of these aspects together to get a better finished product.
Lucy, this conversation, as we set out earlier, is taking place after the recent BRICS summit. What were some of the focal conversations that happened during the BRICS summit that we need to be cognizant of?
So, starting with the energy conversation, a very important, not just important for us, Bronwyn, at the moment. There's a different kind of a crisis in Russia with their stranded resources that they're trying to get out into the world. There's a different kind of energy crisis in Europe, who had built quite a number of their infrastructure to rely on a supply of the input resource from Russia. And all of the turmoil that we're seeing in the world is changing thinking around how we look at energy solutions. In the BRICS Business Council, we have an energy and green economy working group, and I think it's apt that it is titled Energy and Green Economy, because these have to work hand in glove. As we look at energy solutions, we need to make sure that we're mindful of the impact on the environment, however, and do so in a manner that is just for all nations, not penalize nations that are still energy starved because we are chasing the green economy at all cost. So energy featured very importantly for me. Very important factor was food security, because the shocks that we saw with the supply chains closing and product being hardly available for many nations that we're used to importing, or product being stranded on its way to destinations. The food security declaration was a very, very important declaration and outcome from the BRICS summit. There is currently engagement on BRICS industrialization initiative. That engagement is still at government level, but because industry talks to business, we have already flagged that as the BRICS Business Council, we would like to have a voice in those engagements that we are seeing. Brendan, may I take the advantage of your question and also just highlight that our biggest excitement as South Africa Inc. is that one of our young entrepreneurs was spotted, who actually works in the digital space, Ziad Obakeng Machoko, who has, together with his partners, developed a digital platform that they would like, that they are busy rolling out in South Africa to the taxi industry. But they've done research, they've traveled to the rest of the continent and believe that there's application to the matatus or whatever you call them in the different nations in the continent as well. These youngsters caught the attention of China. And had it not been for the lockdown that is so stringent in China at the moment, they would have traveled to China to go and exhibit their product. So there are innovations that are coming out of South Africa that are catching the attention of our BRIC partners, and that excites me.
Zia, let's pick up on that. To what extent are you celebrating young entrepreneurs that are really turning the digital revolution on its head?
Yeah, I'd say every day. You know, we see really smart individuals that think outside the box. They don't have inhibitions. They really want us to give them the platform where they could showcase their talent, their ability, their smart ideas. And really, that's what we're creating, right? And that's what I think BRICS gives them. It gives us the ability to showcase our talent and our innovations, because that's what we want to scale. We want to take our IP, spread it across the globe, and show people the promise of South Africa and attract them to our country. But also, in utilizing that opportunity, create a much better presence in South Africa. It excites me that when we talk about these things, young people are getting into all sorts of technology, right? Where they be in the form of becoming cloud technicians or becoming automation specialists, all sorts of different types of technologies. And there's a myriad of those. When Busi was talking about clean energy, I was just thinking about how the digital economy actually supports industrialization. Because if you think about, energy and the fact that you do need predictive maintenance, you need proper dashboarding, you need proper data to tell you when you need to do A or B or C. All of those things are linked to technology. And if human beings and technology are embraced in the same sentence, I think we have a fantastic world going forward. What we do need to make sure is that people are being skilled. People are being given those opportunities. And as the technology evolves, so do people evolve. I like the word that Leslie used, being agile. That's exactly where it is, right? We have to constantly be reviving ourselves, upskilling ourselves, growing ourselves, and being relevant to society. So as technology emerges, so do humans emerge. And how do we complement each other for a better today and a better tomorrow?
Leslie, I want to touch now on the 2 points that Busi raised at the top of the agenda of the BRICS, and the one, obviously, energy, but pulling from that, the just climate transition, specifically in emerging markets. Now, the last time I saw you was walking through Davos at the World Economic Forum, which took place in, was it just a month ago? I get very confused with the dates in my environment at the moment, but it was summer. It's the first summer Davos we've ever had, and that was a huge talking point. So to what extent is the new development bank driving a green agenda, but ensuring, as Busi referred to it, as a just transition in emerging markets?
Thanks, Bronwyn. You are spot on, and Busi is absolutely right in bringing more emphasis to the point around just transition. So New Development Bank has just set itself a target. We've just had the Board of Governors, the 5 Ministers of Finance of the BRICS countries meet, as you know, and they endorsed the bank's new 5-year strategy. 40%, Bronwyn, 40, of the bank's funding will be towards climate mitigation and climate adaptation, which means that our funding will be in the green economy, almost half of the bank's exposure from this year forwards. So, it's not possible for us to finance coal-fired power stations. And therefore ensuring that as we make this transition towards the green economy, what the just transition means is that we are able to train and retrain workers, look at the development of alternate industries. Now, very exciting developments, as you know, there's the green hydrogen industry is a new sort of sector that is developing rapidly. South Africa needs right now, today, a new industrial strategy around the green economy, and the just transition is one part thereof. Let's take Mpumalanga. South Africa has, as you know, about 15 power stations. More than 85% of them are in coal. Most of these power stations, their lifespan is just around 40, 42 years, which means that the crisis will be very acute in the next decade when these power stations reach the end of their useful economic lifespan. We have no choice but to develop the green economy. There's roughly about probably 200,000 workers employed in Mpumalanga alone in these industries, in the coal mines, coal logistics, moving the coal on the road, and so on, and the coal-fired power stations. Mpumalanga cannot, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, continue to rely on the coal industry. We need to develop alternate industries. And therefore, I think developing detailed strategies to the micro granular level of each town, how are we going to resuscitate these smaller municipalities and towns in Mpumalanga in particular, where most of our power stations are located. In short, we are blessed with an abundance of solar energy, wind power. We need to invest in the grid, and most importantly, remove all the remaining obstacles so we can have more private generation. The solutions to our energy crisis, Bronwyn, as we all know, does not lie in Megawatt Park or even in Pretoria, the Union buildings, or in Minister Pravin Gordhan's office. Where Eskom needs to become a more efficient enterprise, but we have to enable new generation, strengthen the transmission grid, and strengthen the municipalities when it comes to distribution. In short, it is essential that we develop detailed plans around the just transition, creating new economic opportunities, because those opportunities will flow from the more innovative green economy that is ahead of us.
I did say I wanted to touch on two topics. I'm going to come back to the food security issue that Busi raised earlier, because I still want to stay on climate change and a just transition. Busi, coming back to you, one of the big topics, certainly on the debate that I hosted at the World Economic Forum in Davos, was the fact that $15 trillion was raised at the click of one's fingers over the COVID-19 crisis. $15 trillion in 2.5 years for COVID-19 relief. Yet, from an energy perspective, specifically into emerging markets, we are on an annual basis $100 billion short of actually closing the financing gap from a climate perspective to meet the 2030 criteria when it comes to the climate agenda. We know that COP27 is happening in Sharm el-Sheikh in November in Egypt. And I just want to understand that we're not going to get derailed. I mean, you mentioned this food crisis, which could be another global crisis, many are saying, that will take away from the climate agenda. It's a difficult question, but I do want you to weigh in on the balance that's going to be achieved there.
First of all, Bronwyn, the commitments that have been made to the just transition should start materializing, so that the gap is not bigger than what you are indicating at the moment. We haven't seen, I think, that quite materialize on the ground yet. It's great that South Africa has a great structure and drive, headed by our former Deputy Reserve Bank Governor, Daniel Mninele, to make sure that that funding is leveraged that has been committed. So the first thing is that the commitments that have been made, that were made at the last COP, must materialize. Because if they do, I believe that the ability to attract new funding, new investors, new opportunities will be much, much higher than if the initial commitments do not actually materialize. So it will be our own fault to move the eye off the ball, so that when we go to Egypt, we now start focusing on new crises rather than ensure that we've covered sufficient ground on the energy solutions that not just this country, but this continent needs as a matter of urgency. So I believe that we need to make sure that our voice remains strong on the energy opportunities, and that we hold those nations that have made the commitments to account, and to make sure that they actually do flow the funds to the countries. And secondly, as we discuss the new crises that we are seeing, let's not lose our eye on the ball of this massive, massive opportunity to correct our energy situation.
Leslie, it looked as though you wanted to come in there. Did I read that signal correctly?
Look, I mean, energy is front and center, and the greening of our energy grid from what is at the moment a hugely coal-dependent one is one of the single biggest priority. And as Busi has correctly pointed out, we have several processes. One of them that emanated out of COP26, where $8.5 billion was pledged by the developed nations, European Union, Great Britain, United States, and so on. But the proof is in the pudding. these funds are pledges and commitments, Bronwyn. It is not actually translated into concrete, real manifested sort of projects on the ground in South Africa. It's important for us to ensure that we put in place the enabling environment. And as I said earlier on, the most important priority, I think, today is to remove the remaining red tape, the remaining bureaucratic and regulatory hurdles that is inhibiting the private sector from generating more power. As you know, I mean, last year, I think it was August, where the minister made a pronouncement that they will remove the obstacles for between 1 megawatt and 100 megawatt. I'm not sure whether that has actually happened, whether the process is now more seamless for independent power producers to, without lots of bureaucratic hurdles, to produce the power. It seems that that process is still slow and bureaucratic. It's imperative that we solve this short-term crisis first, because this is the general, Bronwyn, kind of a, not an inertia, but a negativity today. I mean, I just, listening to the pulse of South Africa through the radio and the television commentary, there's so much anger around about the energy situation. What we need, though, is both short-term interventions, the kinds that I've just described now, medium-term interventions, and then the longer-term ones, which is focused on moving away from a very coal-intensive, fossil fuel-driven energy grid towards a more green and a more sustainable, renewable energy-based one for the future.
Ziad, you mentioned earlier in the conversation that, of course, digital is one way of solving when it comes to discussions around climate change and transition. I mean, the reduction in travel alone, when we talk about flying, if you think about it, in our previous reality, we would have had to all fly into some central location to have this conversation face to face. So again, Ziad, the work group on the digital economy must be taking center stage when it comes to solving, and you brought up the topic earlier, for climate and just energy transition. Is certainly going to play a very, very important role.
Yes, absolutely. I think that it does, take front and center stage, but it's not just one particular piece, right? It's a number of industries all putting their hands together and trying to solve what the actual issue. I mean, Leslie talks about an action plan, right? It's one thing just having an action plan in isolation. It's another thing solving the bigger picture. And I think that's what we need. It's really, which are all those fundamental industries that need to come together, put their minds together, and using technology as an enabler to solve those problems together with the other industry verticals, and come up with that action plan and then drive the execution. I think that's the fundamental thing for me. It's coming up with the solution is one thing. Driving the action plan and the execution is probably more important, because that's where we see the tangible fruits at the end of the day, right? That's where people see the threshold being shifted. That's where people see, yes, there is a meaningful difference. And I think that's all of our responsibilities across all verticals.
Leslie referred to the general pulse of the South African environment that he's picked up through radio, through television, and certainly it is a somber one right now, Busi. But I think what we need to understand, and perhaps again, just thinking about the businesses, small, medium enterprises that may have tuned into this conversation, we need to look to what the future holds, to the fact that as a member of the BRICS configuration, is there a sense of light at the end of the tunnel? We're all in the same environment. As you mentioned, high inflation, we have got, which obviously are high food prices, high fuel prices, and there's a general feeling that we, as we mentioned, we could be heading into perhaps the biggest global food crisis of all time. But I suppose I just don't want to leave this discussion on a negative note. I want to say, because of our grouping in the BRICS, because of what you are exposed to in the discussions in the emerging markets, and I'm talking to all three of you now, considering the discussions that you're having, give me that light at the end of the tunnel that you see as a result of the connectivity that we have within the BRICS environment. Busi.
We need to learn lessons from our mistakes, Bronwyn. And if I may just talk to because I have a slight disagreement with my colleague Leslie on the regulatory hurdles in the energy sector, specifically looking at the localization hurdle. We should have viewed that as an opportunity rather than a hurdle. However, I'm fully aware, because the IDC funded right at the beginning of the renewable energy procurement program, solar manufacturing or assembly plants, and we funded some wind towers, and there were no takers because the program itself took long to roll out, and as a result, those businesses shut. So we need to learn lessons from our own mistakes and take them on board as we pivot for the opportunity that is staring us in the face. There's an opportunity to make sure that this continent has the energy and electricity that it needs. There is money available in the world. We know that for a fact. Even entities that were considered perhaps by some ratings agencies as somewhat marginal were able to raise funding from the New Development Bank. The opportunity is here, and we need to make sure that we take advantage of it. Our conversation with the small, medium enterprises is that they must avail themselves, attend as many of the BRICS Business Council sessions as possible, network, and we will assist them in unlocking the opportunity that is there.
So Leslie, you are now part of the radio, television, broadcast environment that you have been listening to. And as you say, it's been a relatively sober one. You now can change that trajectory with what you say next. So over to you.
I think that we can only be, the architects and the engineers of our own destiny as South Africa. The international funding we can mobilize from the capital markets and support from developed nations for the stimulation, for example, of new industries like green hydrogen, that can only be complementary. We know what needs to be done in South Africa. There are some short-term things that needs to be done to ensure that we can relieve our economy of the current constraints, because the lack of economic growth is at the center of our problems in South Africa. For the last decade, we haven't grown. We're hovering around 1% and will continue to hover there unless we solve the energy problem. What the crisis has done, though, is put it front and center of every single policymaker. I believe that the commitment is there. What is required now, though, is execution. As I mentioned, I believe that we need greater involvement by the private independent power producers, the private sector, and removing the bureaucratic hurdles. I agree fully with Busi that at the same time, we need to stimulate local industry. Let's find ways to build an entire industrial strategy around the production of solar panels, so that as our solar industry continue to develop and become world-class, that we're able to create jobs in the process as well.
Ziad, the cup is half full rather than half empty, I hope, because you've got final word on this discussion. Let's leverage that optimism around the digital environment.
No, absolutely. Always half full, right? I think we have to remain optimistic. I think in South Africa, we got a lot going for ourselves. I think it would be remiss of us to think that the other portions of the world don't have similar problems. So we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves, right? We do have challenges. I think we need to grapple with those. We need to find solutions, and we need to have an action plan which is executable, which I think is in process. So if we put that aside and say that we are dealing with those challenges and we're grappling with it, we should also focus on the positives, right? We've come through COVID relatively well. Our economy continues to thrive, right? We do have pockets in our economy that's doing really well. We have a cross-segmentation across multiple verticals that is working. Our digital economy and our banking sector and our mining sector, all of these things are flourishing, right? So we have many, many areas of excellence which we need to remind ourselves on. Overall, I think South Africa is in a position where it has the ability to catalyze itself. And what we need to do as leaders is continue providing the optimism continue to provide the hand up in terms of supporting SMMEs and other people, giving them the right skills in order for us to take advantage of the opportunities locally and globally. So I don't think there's any need for us to be too hard on ourselves, but we do need to grapple with the challenges and fix those in tandem. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
And thank you so much to you all for joining us, giving us exclusive insights from what's happening around your respective boardroom tables. It's certainly been enlightening. It's been a very real conversation. And hopefully it's given those that have tuned in this afternoon a view of really South Africa's role in the BRICS grouping and what it means going forward. Of course, as Busi, you alluded to, we take over the chairship of the BRICS in 2023. So I'm sure we're going to have many more conversations of this nature. Thank you so much to Busi Mabuza, chairperson of the South African chapter of the BRICS Business Council, Leslie Marsdorp, who is vice president and chief financial officer of the New Development Bank, and Ziad Suleiman, chair of the SA BRICS Business Council Digital Economy Working Group. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bronwyn.
Bronwyn.